4. After the election, Trump continues to deny any contacts or connections with Russia or that Russia aided his election. On November 8, 2016, Trump was elected president. 2 days later, Russian officials told the press that Russian government had maintained contact with Trump's immediate entourage during the campaign. In response, Hope Hicks, who had been the Trump campaign spokesperson, said, "We are not aware of any campaign representatives that were in touch with any foreign entities before yesterday, when Mr. Trump spoke with many of the world leaders." Hicks gave an additional statement denying any contact between the campaign and Russia. It never happened. There was no communication between the campaign and any foreign entity during the campaign. On December 10th, 2016, the president reported that U.S. intelligence agencies had concluded that the Russian interfered in last month's presidential election to boost Donald Trump's bid for the White House, end quote. Reacting to the story the next day, President-elect Trump stated, quote, "I think it's ridiculous. I think it's just another excuse," end quote. He continued that no one really knew who was responsible for the hacking, suggesting that the intelligence community had, quote, "no idea if it's Russia or China or somebody. It could be somebody sitting in bed someplace," end quote. The president-elect also said that Democrats were, quote, "putting out," end quote, the story of Russian interference, quote, "because they suffered one of the greatest defeats in the history of politics," end quote. On December 18th, 2016, Podesta told the press that the election was, quote, "distorted by Russian intervention," unquote, and questioned whether the Trump campaign officials had been, quote, "in touch with the Russians." The same day, the chief of staff, Reince Priebus, appeared on Fox News Sunday and declined to say whether the president-elect accepted the intelligence community's determination that Russia intervened in the election. When asked about any contact or coordination between the campaign and Russia, Priebus said, quote, "Even this question is insane. Of course we didn't interface with the Russians." End quote. Priebus added that, quote, "This whole thing is a spin job," end quote, and said that, quote, "The real question is why the Democrats are doing everything they can to delegitimize the outcome of the election." On December 29th, 2016, the Obama administration announced that in response to Russian cyber operations aimed at the U.S. election, it was imposing sanctions and other measures on several Russian individuals and entities. When first asked about the sanctions, President-elect Trump said, quote, "I think we ought to get on with our lives," end quote. He then put out a statement that said, quote, "It's time for our country to move on to bigger and better things," end quote, but indicated that he would not meet with intelligence community leaders the following week for a briefing on the Russian interference. The briefing occurred on January 6, 2017. Following the briefing, the intelligence community released a public version of its assessment, which concluded with high confidence that Russia had intervened in the election through a variety of means with the goal of harming Clinton's electability. The assessment further concluded with high confidence that Putin and the Russian government had developed a clear preference for Trump. Several days later, BuzzFeed published unverified allegations compiled by former British intelligence officer Christopher Steele during the campaign about the candidate Trump's Russia connections under the headline, "These reports," quote, "these reports allege Trump has deep ties to Russia," end quote. In a press conference the next day, the president-elect called the release an, quote, "absolute disgrace," end quote, and said, quote, "I have no dealings with Russia. I have no deals that could happen in Russia because we've stayed away. So I have no deals. I have no loans. I have no dealings. We could make deals in Russia very easily if we wanted to. I just don't want to because I think that would be a conflict," end quote. Several advisors recalled that President-elect viewed stories about his Russian connections, the Russian investigations, and the intelligence community assessment of the Russian interference as a threat to the legitimacy of his electoral victory. Hicks, for example, said that the president-elect viewed the intelligence community assessment as his quote Achilles heel, end quote, because even if Russia had no impact on the election, people could think Russia helped him win, taking away from what he had actually accomplished. Sean Spicer, the first White House communications director, recalled that the president thought the Russia story was developed to undermine the legitimacy of his election. Gates said the president viewed the Russia investigation as an attack on the legitimacy of his win, and Priebus recalled that when the intelligence assessment came out, the president-elect was concerned people would question the legitimacy of his win. B. The president's conduct concerning the investigation of Michael Flynn. Overview. During the presidential transition, incoming National Secretary Advisor Michael Flynn had 2 phone calls with the Russian ambassador to the United States about the Russian response to U.S. sanctions imposed because of Russia's election interference. Excuse me. Sorry. After the press reported on Flynn's contacts with the Russian ambassador, Flynn lied to incoming administration officials by saying he had not discussed sanctions on the calls. The officials publicly repeated those lies in press interviews. The FBI, which previously was investigating Flynn for other matters, interviewed him about the calls in the first week after inauguration, and Flynn told similar lies to the FBI. On January 26, 2017, Department of Justice, DOJ, officials notified the White House that Flynn and the Russian ambassador had discussed sanctions and that Flynn had been interviewed by the FBI. The next night, the president had a private dinner with FBI Director James Comey in which he asked for Comey's loyalty. On February 13, 2017, the president asked Flynn to resign. The following day, the president had a one-to-one conversation with Comey in which he said, quote, "I hope you can see your way clear to letting Flynn go." Evidence. 1. Incoming National Security Advisor Flynn discusses sanctions on Russia with Russian Ambassador Sergei Kislyak. Shortly after the election, President Trump announced he would appoint Michael Flynn as his national security advisor. For the next 2 months, Flynn played an active role in the president's transition team, PTT, coordinating policy positions and communicating with foreign government officials, including Russian Ambassador to the United States, Sergei Kislyak. On December 29, 2016, as noted in Volume 2, Section 2A4, Supra, the Obama administration announced that it was imposing sanctions and other measures on several Russian individuals and entities. That day, multiple members of the PTT exchanged emails about the sanctions and the impact they would have on the incoming administration. And Flynn informed members of the PTT that he would be speaking to the Russian ambassador later that day. Flynn, who was in the Dominican Republic at the time, and K.T. McFarland, who was slated to become Deputy National Security Advisor and was at the Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida with the president-elect and other senior staff, talked by phone about what, if anything, Flynn should communicate to Kislyak about the sanctions. McFarland had spoken with incoming administration officials about the sanctions and Russia's possible response, and thought that she had mentioned in those conversations that Flynn was scheduled to speak with Kislyak. Based on those conversations, McFarland informed Flynn that incoming administration officials at Mar-a-Lago did not want Russia to escalate the situation. At 4:43 p.m. that afternoon, McFarland sent an email to several officials about the sanctions and informed that group that, quote, "General Flynn is talking to Russia ambassador this evening," unquote. Approximately 1 hour later, McFarland met with the president-elect and senior officials and briefed them on the sanctions and Russia's possible responses. Incoming Chief of Staff Reince Priebus recalled that McFarland may have mentioned at the meeting that the sanctions situation could be cooled down and not escalated. McFarland recalled that at the end of the meeting, someone may have mentioned to the president-elect that Flynn was speaking to the Russian ambassador that evening. McFarland did not recall any response by the president-elect. Priebus recalled the president-elect viewed the sanctions as an attempt by the Obama administration to embarrass him by delegitimizing his election. Immediately after discussing the sanctions with McFarland on December 29, 2016, Flynn called Kislyak and requested that Russia respond to the sanctions only in a reciprocal manner without escalating the situation. After the call, Flynn briefed McFarland on its substance. Flynn told McFarland that the Russia response to the sanctions was not going to be escalatory because Russia wanted a good relationship with the Trump administration. On December 30th, 2016, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced that Russia would not take retaliatory measures in response to the sanctions at the time and would be instead, quote, plan further steps to restore Russian-U.S. relations based on the policies of the Trump administration, end quote. Following that announcement, the president-elect tweeted, "Great move on delay by V. Putin. I always knew he was very smart." On December 31st, 2016, Kislyak called Flynn and told him that Flynn's request had been received at the highest level and Russia had chosen not to retaliate in response to the request. Later that day, Flynn told McFarland about his follow-up conversation with Kislyak and Russia's decision not to escalate the sanctions situation based on Flynn's request. McFarland recalled that Flynn thought his phone call had made a difference. Flynn spoke with other incoming administration officials that day, but does not recall whether they discussed the sanctions. Flynn recalled discussing the sanctions issue with incoming administration officials Stephen Bannon the next day. Flynn said that Bannon appeared to know about Flynn's conversation with Kislyak, and he and Bannon agreed that they stopped the train on Russia's response to the sanctions. On January 3rd, 2017, Flynn saw the president-elect in person and thought they discussed the Russian reaction to the sanctions, but Flynn did not have a specific recollection of telling the president-elect about the substance of his call with Kislyak. Members of the intelligence community were surprised by Russia's decision not to retaliate in response to the sanctions. When analyzing Russia's response, they became aware of Flynn's discussion of sanctions with Kislyak. Previously, the FBI had opened an investigation of Flynn based on his relationship with the Russian government. Flynn's contacts with Kislyak became a key component of that investigation.